They say the city never sleeps, but that's a lie. In its darkest hours, it hides under the covers like a frightened child, gasping and wheezing for just one more breath. It's the bête noire for those that call it home, and the nightmares it plants inside your mind are the kind that leave the sheets drenched in cold sweat. The kind that have you staring out the window in the dark, looking desperately for the monsters that reside there. No such thing as monsters, you say? Guess again. They're out there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for you to venture into the wrong alley. I've seen them. I've even been one, now and then. Stay in Warrentown long enough, and you'll be one too. I was born in this city, and someday I'll die here too. Sooner or later I'll be just a little too slow, make one too many enemies, turn my back to the wrong door. That's life, my friend. Not just mine, but everyone's. Sooner or later the old Grim Reaper comes calling, and he will not be denied. I should know, because cleaning up after him is my job. My name is Q Mukherjee. I carry a badge. It was just another work day at Central Precinct when we got the call. My partner and I were finishing our reports on our latest case, one of the ugly ones. SynCorp had cut the food rations again, and folks started disappearing. I always hate those cases. Seeing my fellow citizens dressed out for the larder turns my stomach. After all these years, it's one of the few things that still does. We managed to track down the meatleggers to an abandoned mine shaft, dug before the big blowout of 47. We sealed off both ends of the shaft and ordered them out with their hands up. They refused. Big mistake. The Warren sits under the surface of an airless moon. 6065 Mao Shu V, to be exact. They've been mining it for a couple hundred years now, and the rock is riddled with shafts and tunnels. No one knows them all, but the one thing they all have in common is a ventilation duct. Have to, of course. Folks gotta breathe. Unless you get on the wrong side of the law, and they vent your Atmo into space. It was a mess, as you might imagine, which is why Lervo and I were dotting the I's and crossing the T's when Captain Cole came out of his office, with a datapad in his hand. Got a stiff in green sector, section 42, he grumbled, as he ported over the data. Unknown female, with obvious signs of violence. Patrol is already on the scene. Lervo sighed, leaning back in his chair. Captain, can't someone else take it? Q and I are still dealing with our last case. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I working you too hard? Maybe you'd prefer I just send this over to SynCorp Security. They'd love to handle a 187, I'm sure. Lervo and I shared a look. The only thing we hated more than having extra work dumped on us was the threat of SynCorp's goon squad sticking their claws into our business. In theory, the Warren was part of the Shivang Protectorate, with an appointed governor and everything. But in reality, it was a company town, with SynCorp calling the shots. Some of us gamely hung on, avoiding the corporate world like the proverbial plague, but we all knew how the game was played, and we'd be damned if we let those assholes poach one of our cases. Fine, we'll take it, I muttered, as I grabbed my piece from the drawer and slid it into the holster under my left armpit. Lervo took a moment to straighten his vest before we headed out, but then he always had been a snappy dresser. Lervo Radzuk looked like a banker instead of a cop, and he sure as Naraka couldn't afford those threads on what the Protectorate was paying. I never asked where the money came from. None of my business. We all have our little side gigs, and he always did me the courtesy of not prying into mine. Green 42 was on the other side of the Warren, and since our one and only cruiser had finally crapped out for the last time 4 years earlier, we strolled through the concourse on our way to the crime scene. Lervo couldn't help but talk my ear off, as usual. Getting any action lately? He asked with a leer. Considering his species looked like an animated corpse even on his best days, it had real impact. or would have, if we hadn't been partnered for the last 10 years. I just rolled my eyes. There are exactly 194 humans in the Warren, and of those only 13 are females of an eligible age, and every single one of them hates me. I snorted. So, no. Lervo chuckled. You humans are so provincial. You should really consider broadening your horizons. He grinned. You have no idea what you're missing. Though if it's that important to you, you could always find yourself a shapeshifter. I shuddered, just as he'd known I would. I am not getting intimate with a skinwalker, I growled. You never know where they've been. What if their last customer was a uvu? There are certain parts of my anatomy I'd prefer not have melted off. Besides, they never get the eyes right. My partner just laughed again. He enjoyed needling me, and if I hadn't learned over the years I could absolutely count on him to watch my back, I would have put in for a transfer years ago. Well, you need to do something, Q, he continued, with slightly less mirth. You've been alone far too long. He just was not going to let this go. I tell you what, next time Earth sends a batch of colonists, I'll look over the manifest. Bound to be at least one female traveling solo. That's the spirit, he beamed, clapping me on the back as we entered Green Sector. Section 42 wasn't far from the border, and within minutes we'd spotted the uniforms guarding the crime scene. We pulled out our IDs as we approached. I'm Detective Mukherjee, and this is my partner, Detective Radzuk, I said by way of introduction, as we stepped over the crime tape and pulled on our gloves. What have you got for us? The sergeant in charge pulled out his datapad. Got a dead Hatara, he said bluntly, as he guided us to the body. Looks like someone slashed her throat. Lervo and I shared another look, this one far less charitable. And you know she's a Hatara how, exactly? I asked him, with a tone I hoped came across as withering sarcasm. Hard to tell with some of the species. Green 42 is a well-known spot for Hataras to ply their wares, he continued, utterly oblivious. Besides, look at how she's dressed. We'd come to a halt in one of the side tunnels. The body lay crumpled at our feet, and the sergeant did have a point. What little clothing she was wearing didn't conceal much. Of course, that might have been because most of it had been ripped from her body and strewn about. Everyone looks smaller in death. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because some vital part is taken away, deflating them somehow. Or perhaps it's because we're so used to seeing folks move that we take it as a matter of course, and that same lack of movement is what makes them seem to shrink. This one looked positively bantam-sized, which was appropriate for an avian. Long white plumage streamed back from her head, while her body was covered in soft red downy feathers. She was striking, in her way, even in death. Some would have found her exotic. Milk-white pupils embedded in reddish orbs stared blankly at the tunnel ceiling as blood pooled beneath her. The sergeant was also right about the cause of death, her throat slashed down to the bone. Any witnesses? Lervo asked, drawing a snort from the sergeant. In this sector? You're kidding, right? He nodded as the uniform relayed the news. It wasn't unexpected, but sometimes you got lucky. While Lervo took the sergeant's statement, I pulled out my scanner, checking her DNA. Everyone's in the database, and within seconds, I had my answer. Her name is Lysilsa Atherian. She is 1721 years old and has no listed occupation. Her next of kin is Kolarir Atherian, who is her brother. Kolarir is 2348 years old and works as a miner for Syncorp Mining Division, though he is currently inactive. Got a hit, I told Lervo, holding up my scanner. He glanced at the readout and nodded, before turning back to the sergeant. You searched the area? He asked. This section, and the 8 adjoining it. The uniform confirmed. No sign of the weapon. Of course not. Lervo sighed as he bent down beside me. No jewelry, no credit rod, torn clothing. Has all the earmarks of an encounter gone bad? He pronounced, rising to his feet and peeling off his gloves. Mark it as an unsolvable and call for the wagon. Got it, the sergeant acknowledged as he moved away and started speaking into his comm. I rose as well. What about the brother? I asked. Might be worth having a conversation with him. What's he going to tell us? That she was a Hetira? It's a waste of time, Q. And besides, you know the captain will never approve the extra hours. Not for a Hetira. For some reason, I wasn't prepared to give up that easily. Who's she working for, I wonder? Maybe she's one of Madame Midnight's girls. Down here? No way. Has to be an independent. You know as well as I do, Madame Midnight keeps her ladies under a tight leash. Any of her girls caught moonlighting doesn't make the same mistake twice. Still, I argued, no one knows that side of the street better than she does. Again, so what? If she's an independent, then Madame Midnight wouldn't know her schedule, which means no way of knowing who the John was. It's a loser of a case, and you know it, so why are you pushing it so hard? Lervo looked at me curiously, awaiting a response. I didn't have one. Not a good one, anyway. You're right, I sighed. Let me just get some shots of the scene for the file, and we'll head back to Central, I told him, as I started recording. Suit yourself, he shrugged, walking from the crime scene to wait for the wagon. I covered the area as best I could, recording the body from every angle. Through the lens, she looked even more fragile, more broken. But then, I guess they all do. Comes with the territory. The wagon showed up a few minutes later, and once the body was loaded up, Lervo and I headed back to Central to file our preliminary report, before calling it a night. But the night is a quiet time, and when you're alone with your thoughts, you start dredging back up the events of the day. Hard not to, even when you've seen as much as I have. Damn it. She was just a kid. Something told me I couldn't just let this one go. I dragged my carcass out of bed early the next morning and dabbed a damp cloth across my face in lieu of a shower. The water rationing was affecting everything in the Warren, and unless SynCorp found another ice deposit, things were going to get grim. Word on the street was their last 7 digs had all come up empty, and everyone was feeling the pinch. It was the reason behind the food rationing as well. The yeast vats used a lot of good old-fashioned H2O. Every day, ordinary folks got squeezed a little harder, and it was only a matter of time before some of them went under for good. But the water shortage wasn't what was on my mind as I made my way downtown. I was still turning my latest case over in my head, even though Captain Cole was going to close the books. I didn't have much to go on, and since the only hard evidence I had at the moment was Lysilsa's body, that meant a trip to the morgue. I knew the medical examiner, and I was certain she'd be willing to make a deal, though I wasn't looking forward to my end of it. I always felt unclean afterwards. The smell was just as bad as I remembered. When you have the mortal remains of 100 different species floating around, the air is definitely going to get a little ripe. Doc Takagi was signing in another stiff when I arrived, and her long green neck raised up as I wandered in. Detective Mukherjee, she said with a nod. This is a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the honor? Need a favor, Doc, I told her. Is there someplace we can talk? She inclined her head towards the exam room. Step into my office, she said, as the body she'd signed for was wheeled away. I took a deep breath and followed her inside. I may see death on a regular basis, but I'm no more a fan of it than anyone else. How someone like the doc can just blithely hang around stiffs all day is beyond me. Luckily, whoever was on the table was still covered with a sheet. Doc Takagi took a seat behind her desk and folded her long fingers together. So, what exactly is this favor, Detective? You had a body come in yesterday, I explained. A Lysilsa Ethrian, avian. Cole is probably going to call it an unsolvable and close the case, but I was hoping you'd take a look for me. Off the books. I see, she said after a moment. And what is your interest in this matter? I'd been kicking around that question in my head ever since Lervo asked, and I was no closer to answering it now than I was then. Just something about it, I said with a shrug. The doc looked at me, obviously expecting more, but when nothing else was forthcoming, she finally nodded. I can perform a cursory exam, she said affably, but I'll need something from you in return. Yeah, I figured, I said with a sigh. What's the job? One of my clients has fallen behind in his payments, she informed me as she handed over a name and address. It's their first offense, so I think a warning will suffice. A stern warning, she said coldly. Got it, I told her as I slipped the information into my pocket. Consider it done. Excellent, she smiled. I'm a little backed up at the moment, but I should have something for you later today. You've got my number, I told her as I headed for the door. Thanks again. I didn't look at the name in my pocket. I hate these jobs, but that's how the universe works. Good old Doc Takagi ran one of the biggest numbers rackets in the Warren, and she always needed muscle to shake loose the credits when the customers didn't feel like paying up. I avoided the really rough stuff. I am a cop after all. But usually all it took was me flashing my badge and threatening to lock them up on some trumped-up charge. Sometimes I'd slap them around a little. No big deal. That's what I keep telling myself, at least. By the time I got to the squad room, I was running a little behind. Lervo looked up from the case file he was pursuing and flashed me a knowing grin. Decided to take my advice after all? He smirked. Just overslept, I replied as I slid into my chair. For a moment, it looked like he was going to dig a little deeper, but something changed his mind. He went back to his case file while I pulled up the information we had in the system on Lysilsa and blinked in surprise when nothing came back. If she was a Hetera, she must have been new at it. I then decided to check out her brother, Colorir Etherion. There wasn't much to go on. Apparently, he'd managed to keep his nose clean for the most part. A couple of minor offenses as a juvenile, stealing food, a petty possession rap. By Warren standards, that practically made him Citizen of the Year. His record with SynCorp was clean as well, though he'd been laid off recently due to the work slowdown. Until they found a new deposit, a lot of their miners were being idled, which made me wonder what he was doing for credits these days. Sponging off his sister, perhaps? Vishnu knew he wouldn't be the first brother to put his sister out on the street, but something about his record made me suspect otherwise. It wasn't enough. I needed more. Heading out for a while, I told my partner. Got some errands to run. Lervo leaned back in his chair, regarding me thoughtfully. Anything I need to know about? Just tying up a few loose ends, I informed him. Call me if we catch a case. Will do. He nodded affably, but I could tell by the look in his eyes I wasn't fooling him for a minute. Sooner or later I'd have to fill Lervo in, but for right now it was better for all concerned if I kept him at arm's length. If anything did come down because of my investigation, at least it wouldn't splatter on him. I'd looked up the last known address for the Ethrian siblings, a tiny apartment in Yellow Sector. Not bad, all things considered. When I arrived, I walked up the 4 flights of stairs and knocked on the door, though I neglected to mention I was a cop. You start pounding on a door and shouting, "Police!" Even innocent folks do something stupid like try and run for it, and I'm getting too old for that nonsense. No response. I knocked again, and still nothing. A quick glance around the hallway confirmed I was alone. The lock on the door was a joke. It took me only a few seconds to spring the door, slipping inside without a sound. And found nothing. I don't mean the place was clean. I mean, there was nothing. The apartment had been stripped down to the floorboards and thoroughly scrubbed. Not a scrap of furniture remained. No clothing, no garbage, no anything. And unless my nose was mistaken, it had even been fumigated and sterilized. I doubt this rat trap had ever been this clean since it was built. My cop sense was suddenly on high alert, so once I relocked the door and slipped out again, I went to the manager's office and rang the bell. A wizened Bischoffen answered the door.
"Yes?"
he asked cautiously. I held up my badge. "Detective Mukherjee, I have a few questions about the avians who lived in 407. A smile broke out on his face. "Such sweet kids," he said happily. "I really hated to see them go. Always paid on time, never caused problems. Lysilsa even used to come down just to chat sometimes." A look of suspicion caused his eyes to narrow. "Why are you interested in them?" "It's just routine, I promise," I replied, with a smile of my own. "Can you tell me when they moved out?"
Must have been a couple weeks ago,"
he answered, after giving it a moment's thought.
"A crew of workers came to move out their belongings, even cleaned up behind them."
He sounded surprised by that. I didn't blame him.
"I don't suppose they left a forwarding address?" I asked, hopefully.
The Bischoffen shook his head.
"I'm afraid not."
"I got the impression they got a place in one of the SynCorp dorms. You'd have to ask them." SynCorp. Now why would they be involved? Especially with a miner who'd been laid off. "I'll do that," I smiled. "Thank you for your help." I turned and exited the building, only now I had even more questions, and no answers. If they'd moved out 2 weeks ago, then where had they been staying? Where was the brother now? And when did SynCorp get into the cleaning and moving business? My phone suddenly rang, pulling me out of my reverie. The ID belonged to the morgue. "Hey, Doc," I answered. "What have you got for me?"
"Not much,"
Tikaji replied. "Cause of death is exactly as it appeared. Exsanguination due to deep tissue laceration of the pharynx.
Tox screen came up negative.
If you want a more thorough forensic examination, I'm afraid it will cost you." I considered that one for a moment. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Can you put her on ice until I decide?" "In case you hadn't heard, ice is a scarce commodity lately." She chuckled. Doc Tikaji had a really odd sense of humor. "But I can store the body for a few days." There was a brief pause, and then, "I did find 2 other things, which may or may not help you." "I'm all ears," I told her. "First, whoever murdered her knew what he was doing," she informed me. "A single deep cut, no hesitation marks. Real pro work." "I see," I said carefully. I'd handled hetera killings before, and they were always crimes of passion. The psycho wielding the blade rarely knew what he was doing, and generally made a real mess of things. Even if they did know how to use a knife, a clean death was never what these animals wanted. No, they wanted the poor girl to suffer. A single cut from a pro didn't fit the profile at all. Not for a psycho, at least. What the doc was describing sounded more like a professional hit. Only, why would a pro kill a nobody like Lysilsa? The more I dug into this case, the worse it smelled. "And the other thing you found?" I prompted. "She had something in her hand," Tikaji continued. "I had to pry her fingers away to find it. She was clutching it so hard. An address in Green 29. Green 29. Not far from where we'd found the body. "Send me the address," I told her. "And thanks." "And my end of the deal?" She reminded me sharply. "I'll take care of it tonight," I said quietly as I hung up the phone.